There is a story that millions live by, yet few truly know its origins. It begins not with divine revelation, but with a terrified child standing in a Pittsburgh shop, chalk in hand, writing desperate messages on the walls. That child would grow into a man who would reshape the spiritual landscape of millions, not through charisma or miracles, but through something far more powerful and enduring: the printed word. Charles Taze Russell was born into an America obsessed with the end of the world. The mid-1800s were alive with apocalyptic fever. Preachers shouted from street corners about lakes of fire and eternal damnation. Churches competed to terrify their congregations into submission. And young Charles, raised in a strict Presbyterian household, absorbed every word with the intensity that only a frightened child can muster. The doctrine of hell consumed him. Not in the way it motivated others to piety, but in a way that shattered his faith entirely. He couldn't reconcile the image of a loving God with one who would torture people for eternity. The mathematics didn't work. The logic collapsed. And so, as a teenager working in his father's clothing store, he began his rebellion. He scrawled anti-hell messages on walls, on boards, anywhere customers might see them. He wanted people to question what they'd been told. He wanted them to see the contradiction that haunted him. But rejection wasn't enough. Russell needed answers. He needed a system that made sense, a framework that could hold the weight of his questions. And so he began to search, attending meetings, reading theological texts, engaging with every alternative interpretation he could find. This wasn't casual curiosity. This was obsession. He was building something in his mind, piece by piece, a new understanding of Scripture that would eventually consume his entire life. Then came the moment that changed everything. In his early 20s, Russell encountered a small group of Adventist Bible students. They introduced him to a concept that would become the foundation of his entire worldview: the invisible return of Christ. They claimed that Jesus had already come back to earth in 1874, not in the clouds with trumpet blasts, but silently, invisibly, beginning a spiritual presence that only the enlightened could discern. This idea captivated Russell. It meant the end times weren't coming, they were already here. The world was living in its final days, oblivious to the cosmic drama unfolding around them. Russell threw himself into prophetic study with the fervor of a man possessed. He created elaborate charts, intricate timelines connecting the book of Daniel to Revelation to contemporary world events. He measured pyramids, calculated biblical chronologies, and developed what he called divine mathematics. Everything had meaning. Every number was a clue. The Bible wasn't just a spiritual guide, it was an encrypted message, and Russell believed he had found the code. By 1879, he was ready to share his discoveries with the world. But how? Traditional churches had rejected him. Established denominations saw him as a heretic. He needed a platform that didn't require permission, a voice that couldn't be silenced by ecclesiastical authorities. And so he created something revolutionary for its time, a magazine that would serve as prophet, teacher, and authority all at once. He called it Zion's Watchtower and Herald of Christ's Presence. The title itself was a mission statement. A watchtower was a place of vigilance, of warning, of seeing what others could not. And what Russell saw, or claimed to see, was the invisible presence of Christ and the approaching end of all earthly systems. The magazine would be his pulpit, his printing press his cathedral. And through it, he would reach not hundreds, but thousands, and eventually millions. The early issues of the Watchtower were filled with confident declarations. Russell wrote with the certainty of a man who believed he had unlocked ancient secrets. He published his prophetic calculations, his chronological charts, his reinterpretations of traditional doctrines. But more importantly, he began to establish a pattern that would define the organization for over a century. The magazine itself became the source of truth. This was the crucial innovation, the moment when Russell moved from religious publisher to spiritual architect. He didn't just present his ideas as one man's interpretation. He presented them as revelations channeled through the Watchtower itself. In his writings, he began to describe the magazine as the means by which God communicated with his people on earth. Not the Bible alone. Not personal prayer or direct revelation. But this specific publication, produced by this specific organization, interpreted by this specific group of men. The implications were staggering. If the Watchtower was God's channel, then disagreeing with it wasn't a matter of theological debate. It was rebellion against divine authority. If the magazine spoke for heaven, then its words carried the weight of Scripture itself. Russell had created something that transcended his own mortality. He had built a system where the printed page became sacred text. And the system worked. As the magazine circulated, readers didn't just consume information, they were transformed by it. They began to see the world through the Watchtower's interpretive framework. Current events became prophetic fulfillments. Historical patterns became divine signs. The magazine didn't just report on reality. It created a lens through which reality itself was perceived and understood. Russell understood something that few religious leaders of his era grasped. In the age of mass printing, whoever controlled the narrative controlled the faith. While other preachers were limited by the size of their congregations and the reach of their voices, Russell could speak simultaneously to thousands of people across continents. His words appeared in homes from Pennsylvania to California, from England to Australia. The printing press had become his miracle, his multiplication of loaves and fishes. But it wasn't just about distribution. It was about standardization. Before mass media, religious belief was local, personal, interpreted through individual experience and community tradition. The Watchtower changed that. It created a unified system of belief, a standardized interpretation that erased local variations and personal insights. Every reader, regardless of where they lived or what their background was, would receive the same message, internalize the same doctrines, and view the world through the same prophetic lens. By the 1890s, Russell had built an impressive publishing empire. He wasn't just producing a monthly magazine. He had written 6 volumes of studies in the Scriptures, massive tomes that his followers came to regard as essential companions to the Bible itself. In fact, Russell went further. He wrote that reading his books alone would keep someone in the light of God, but reading the Bible alone would leave them in darkness. This wasn't modesty. This was a bold claim to indispensability. The message was clear. Scripture needed Russell's interpretation to be understood correctly. This created a fascinating dynamic. The movement was ostensibly about returning to pure biblical Christianity, stripping away centuries of tradition and church authority. Yet in practice, it created a new authority more centralized than anything the Catholic Church had ever achieved. At least Catholic tradition claimed to be the accumulated wisdom of councils and saints across centuries. Russell's authority came from one man's calculations, one man's charts, one man's prophetic insights, all filtered through one magazine. And what happened when those prophecies failed? Because they did fail, repeatedly and spectacularly. Russell had calculated that Christ would return visibly in 1878. When that didn't happen, the Watchtower explained that he had come, but invisibly. When 1881 passed without the expected rapture of believers to heaven, the magazine reframed it as the beginning of a time of testing. Each failed prediction was transformed into a fulfilled prophecy, just not in the way originally expected. This is where the Watchtower's true power became evident. It wasn't in predicting the future accurately. It was in controlling the interpretation of the past. The magazine could never be wrong because it could always redefine what right meant. Failure became revelation. Error became progressive understanding. Contradiction became new light. The system was self-correcting, not through admission of mistakes, but through creative reinterpretation that maintained the illusion of continual divine guidance. Russell's central prophecy, the one that defined his entire movement, focused on the year 1914. He calculated, through his complex biblical chronologies and measurements of the Great Pyramid of Giza, that all earthly governments would end by that year. God's kingdom would fully establish itself on earth. The old world would pass away, and only Russell's followers would understand what was happening. 1914 arrived. The world didn't end. Instead, it went to war. World War I erupted across Europe, bringing devastation on a scale humanity had never seen. For a lesser movement, this would have been fatal. The central prophecy had failed. The promised kingdom hadn't come. But the Watchtower had been preparing for this moment, consciously or not, for decades. It had built a system that could survive prophetic failure because it had trained its readers to accept reinterpretation as revelation. The magazine declared that the prophecy had been fulfilled, just spiritually rather than physically. Christ had indeed begun his reign in 1914, but in heaven, not on earth. The war was evidence of Satan being cast down from heaven, angry at his defeat, taking his rage out on humanity. What looked like failure was actually confirmation. What seemed like error was actually truth misunderstood. The Watchtower had turned its greatest potential disaster into its strongest evidence. And this is the genius of what Russell created. It wasn't just a religious movement. It was a self-sustaining mythology, a narrative engine that could adapt to any contradiction, survive any failure, and continue generating belief regardless of external reality. Then, in 1916, Russell died. He was traveling through Texas on one of his preaching tours when illness overtook him. He was found on a train, exhausted, reportedly dressed in a Roman toga, which he apparently wore as a symbolic gesture. His followers were devastated. The man they called the faithful and wise servant, the prophet chosen by God to feed his people, was gone. Some wondered if the movement could survive without him. But something unexpected happened. Within months of Russell's death, a lawyer named Joseph Rutherford seized control of the organization. And Rutherford understood something crucial. Russell himself had become a liability. The movement had grown around his personality, his interpretations, his prophetic calculations. If it remained tied to one man's vision, it would die with that man's reputation. The scandals of Russell's later years, the failed prophecies, the public court cases about miracle wheat that he'd promoted and sold, the bitter divorce proceedings where his wife accused him of manipulation and psychological control, all of this threatened to undo everything. So Rutherford began the systematic erasure of Charles Taze Russell from the movement's narrative. He removed Russell's portrait from the publications. He stopped reprinting his books. He began changing doctrines that Russell had considered fundamental. The title, Faithful and Wise Servant, which had referred specifically to Russell, was quietly reassigned. Now it didn't mean one man. It meant the organization itself, a collective entity that transcended any individual. This was the final evolution of Russell's creation. He had built a system where the Watchtower magazine was the voice of God. Rutherford took it one step further. The magazine was now the voice of an organization, and that organization itself was God's sole channel on earth. No longer dependent on any single prophet or leader, it had become something more dangerous, a self-perpetuating mechanism of authority that could outlive all its creators. The irony is profound. Russell had spent his youth rebelling against church authority, against the idea that human institutions could stand between individuals and God. Yet he built one of the most authoritarian religious structures in modern history. He wanted to free people from the fear of hellfire. Yet he created a system that controlled through a different kind of fear. The fear of being cut off from God's organization, the fear of thinking independently, the fear of questioning what the magazine published. Under Rutherford and his successors, the Watchtower became even more controlling. It didn't just interpret Scripture, it dictated every aspect of life. What medical treatments were acceptable, who you could associate with, what education you could pursue, how you should dress, speak, think. The magazine published new light constantly, and members were expected to accept each change as divine revelation, even when it directly contradicted what had been taught as divine revelation just years before. The weekly study meetings became exercises in thought control. Members would read the same paragraphs, answer predetermined questions with predetermined answers, all designed to reinforce the authority of the organization. Independent thinking was labeled as dangerous, as prideful, as satanic. The Bible itself became secondary. Members studied the Watchtower's interpretation of the Bible more than they studied the actual text. Just as Russell had predicted, his followers were walking in light because of his publications, not because of Scripture alone. And here's what makes this story so unsettling. It worked. It's still working. Millions of Jehovah's Witnesses around the world study the Watchtower magazine every week. They memorize its arguments. They quote it more readily than they quote the Bible. Most of them have never heard of Charles Taze Russell, or if they have, they know him only as a minor historical figure, someone who started things but was quickly superseded by greater organizational wisdom. They don't know that every structure of authority they submit to, every pattern of belief they accept, every mechanism of control they experience, was designed by a man who died over a century ago. A man who was terrified of hell as a child and spent his life building a different kind of hell, a prison made of printed pages, where the bars are invisible but the control is absolute. Russell's greatest achievement wasn't his prophetic calculations or his theological innovations. It was creating a system that could survive being wrong. A framework that could adapt to any failure, reinterpret any error, and emerge stronger from every contradiction. He built something that didn't need to be correct. It only needed to be consistent in its claim to authority. The Watchtower today still operates on Russell's original formula. It still claims to be God's exclusive channel on earth. It still publishes predictions about the imminent end of the world, though it's learned to be more careful, more vague, leaving room for reinterpretation when timelines don't pan out. It still disfellowships those who question too loudly, cutting them off from family and friends, using social isolation as punishment for independent thought. It still produces a steady stream of publications, now digital as well as print, maintaining the constant flow of centralized interpretation that Russell pioneered. The organization has outlived its founder by over a century, exactly as he designed it to. He created something more powerful than himself, more enduring than his reputation, more influential than his actual ideas. He created a mythology that became self-sustaining, a narrative that feeds itself, a system of belief that doesn't require evidence or accuracy, only loyalty and repetition. This is the real legacy of Charles Taze Russell, not his failed prophecies or his elaborate chronologies, but his demonstration that in the age of mass media, whoever controls the published word can control belief itself. He proved that religion doesn't need miracles or divine intervention to thrive. It only needs a printing press, a distribution network, and a claim to exclusive truth. The boy who feared hell created millions who now fear something else. The loss of certainty, the terror of being outside the organization, the panic of having to think for themselves. He replaced one form of psychological control with another, perhaps more subtle but equally powerful. The threat isn't eternal fire anymore. It's eternal separation from the only group that claims to have truth. And perhaps most disturbing of all, this system has proven remarkably resistant to external criticism or internal reform. Because Russell built into it a defense mechanism. Any criticism from outside confirms that the world is against God's organization, just as predicted. Any doubt from inside is evidence of spiritual weakness, of Satan's influence, of pride that must be crushed. The system validates itself through opposition and silences dissent through guilt and fear. More than a century after its founding, the Watchtower continues its mission, not to free people, but to program them. Not to encourage thinking, but to replace it. Not to interpret Scripture, but to override it. The magazine that Russell created as a tool for spreading his ideas became a machine for manufacturing compliance, turning individual faith into collective ideology, transforming spiritual seeking into organizational obedience. This is how Charles Taze Russell created the Watchtower myth. Not through divine revelation, but through human psychology. Not through prophetic accuracy, but through narrative control. Not through spiritual power, but through the power of the press. He took a simple innovation, a religious magazine, and turned it into one of the most effective mechanisms of thought control in modern religious history. The man is forgotten, erased by his own organization. But his creation lives on, still speaking with authority, still claiming divine appointment, still controlling millions who have never heard his name. He wanted immortality, and in a twisted way, he achieved it. Not through his prophecies, which all failed. Not through his personality, which has been systematically removed from history. But through his methodology, which has become so embedded in the organization that it operates automatically, requiring no prophet, no founder, no visible leader at all. Just pages. Printed or digital. Distributed and studied. Memorized and internalized. Week after week, year after year, generation after generation. The Watchtower still stands, not as Russell imagined it, but as something far more powerful. A self-sustaining system of belief that has transcended its creator and become, for millions, the very voice of God. And that is the most successful and most troubling innovation in the history of modern religion. The transformation of a magazine into Scripture, of publication into revelation, of a printing press into a God that speaks only through its chosen organization, forever and ever, world without end.